Hey everybody, happy Thursday evening tutorial stream. I'm so sorry that I am so late on this torch tutorial of Thursday. Had some stuff that needed to happen before stream. Also, there it is, cool. And then running around like a chicken with my head cut off, getting my supplies for this evening's tutorial. And I still haven't gotten them all, so bear with me as I randomly pick things out of my drawer while I am talking to y'all. But I hope everyone had a solidly good Thursday. Our Thursday here at Beading Dreams was, or at least my Thursday was, hectic. Seems like there were 17 million things to do and definitely not enough time in which to do them, but I am so happy to torch out my frustrations tonight with you. So this is our project for this evening. This is our, yay, that's exciting. Amy's Wi-Fi crapped out this afternoon, and so she was not able to join us for the lunchtime stream. So this is our mixed metal pendant, and I'm going to be doing mine just out of all copper and silver tonight because late already. I don't want to mess around with Super Pickle. Talk about Super Pickle a little bit when it comes time to the point where you would use it, but I'm going to just do copper and sterling for my project this evening. So let's talk tools and supplies for this evening's tutorial. All right, supplies first, because of course, since it is a soldering tutorial, that's going to be your lesser list. So you're going to need some sheet metal. 24 gauge is going to work great for this project. So like I said, I'm going to do all mine in copper this evening, but my prototype I actually did using 3 colors. I used sterling silver, I used copper, and I actually used some brass sheet metal down at the bottom. Well, Lori, I'm really glad that you actually got a new phone before your old phone blew up in your purse, because that is not good. Yeah, hard pass on the exploding phone. In addition to your 24 gauge sheet metal, you're going to need a couple of different gauges of wire. You're going to need a little bit of 18 gauge wire, not a ton. That's going to be for the bail at the top of your pendant. And then you are going to need some 3mm by 1mm or 2mm by 1mm rectangular wire. I'm pretty sure I actually used 2x1 on my prototype, so the one I'm using this evening is 1mm taller. Shouldn't make that much of a difference. So I really like the way that this is kind of, they're like pseudo bezels around these little components, and I could totally see just making a bunch of these and like soldering them, you know, soldering one on a ring, soldering, actually that would be a cool ring too if you wanted like a big dramatic like multi-finger ring. Soldering these on a bangle bracelet, making earrings, of course. I also, you know, had ideas about you could pour resin in these, and then you would have the texture on the back that would show through the color of the resin, so that could also be loads of fun. So lots of cool things you could do with this technique. But yeah, so what I'm using for the little pseudo bezels on the sides this evening is going to be 3mm by 1mm rectangular wire that is sterling. And then I'm going to need all 3 of my solders. I'm going to need my medium, my easy, and my extra easy solder. As far as tools go, of course, this is a soldering tutorial, so there's a lot of tools. You know, most of them are just kind of part and parcel of fabrication, and so hopefully if you are a fabricator, you have, you know, most or all of these tools already collated in one place if you are looking into starting to fabricate. And fabrication, in brief, is taking sheet metal and wire and turning it into jewelry. So this is different from, say, casting, where you actually, you know, carve a wax, make a mold, and molten metal is poured into the mold to make your piece. So fabrication is fantastic. It does have some limitations since you're essentially crafting 3-dimensional objects from 2-dimensional items versus, you know, casting where you're actually carving a 3-dimensional model. But you can still do lots of fun and awesome things with fabrication, so I am a huge fan. You are going to need a torch. This is my Blazer butane torch. Of course, everyone knows that's my most favorite torch ever. If you're going to fabricate with sterling silver, 14 karat gold, brass, bronze, and copper, you need a torch. You can't do this with an iron, and iron does not get hot enough, okay? So you need a torch. You're going to need a soldering surface. I'm going to be using my solderite board. That's the one I typically use. It's a hard soldering surface. so you can't push anything into it, and that's really all we need. Ooh, excuse me. I imagine it was a hectic day, y'all. Goodness. I feel like I was running around like a chicken with my head cut off all freaking day. Anyway, so I think the hard soldering surface is all we're going to need for this evening's tutorial. I reserve the right to be wrong about that, so I may have to grab my fire brick if it turns out I need a soft soldering surface, but I'm pretty sure we can get through the whole tutorial with just the solderite. You're going to need flux. We're going to talk about what that is and what it does. It's this pasty substance in this jar here. We're going to talk about what that is and what it does when it comes time to use it. Off camera, I've got pickle and my pickle pot, and we're going to talk about what that is and what it does when it comes time for me to use it as well. Other tools, hand tools, I'm going to need metal shears. I'm going to need my regular pliers, my round nose, my chain nose, and specifically my wire cutter. And then I'm going to need bail making pliers. So for anybody who's not familiar, thank you, Amy. I'm glad I was running all freaking day and just don't feel like it, because sometimes I'm like, I didn't really do anything, but I'm exhausted. So these are bail making pliers. Bail making pliers are pliers that have cylindrical sections. So rather than being tapered like your typical round nose plier, these have cylindrical sections in specific sizes. So the reason that this pliers is useful is, number one, if you're trying to make a coil, or if you're trying to bend something that's wider like our rectangular wire, because if you were to take our 3mm by 1mm rectangular wire and bend it around your round nose pliers, 3mm, that's a pretty wide span, and you can see that there's a significant taper in our round nose pliers, in that distance. So what the bail making pliers allow you to do is bend that wire around and get a consistent cylinder instead of a cone. Let's see, you're also going to need a bench block or a bench block equivalent, whatever you usually hammer on is good. You're going to need, okay, come on. Okay, you're going to need a texturing hammer. I swear to God I got a texturing hammer, but I don't know what I did with it, so I will find it. You're going to need a texturing hammer or 3. I like to do a different texture on each section of my metal, but you don't have to. You can do them all the same texture. You can also just forego texturing them. You don't have to texture your metals at all. You're going to need your typical fabrication abrasives. So you're going to need a flat file. Sorry, I don't have my little foam up there, and it's just, oh, that's awesome, computer. Sorry, y'all, it's just not been my day today at all. Okay, so file, 320 grit sandpaper, and then your fine steel wool, and also you're probably gonna want a rawhide mallet as well, right? I know, sorry. Hopefully I'm not making anybody seasick. Let me see if I can find that hammer that I got out. Oh, I left it over here. That's awesome.
Well, the glass counter is a great place for a hammer.
Well, I mean, if you're just setting it on the counter, it's fine. But, yeah, keep 10 feet away from me. Not a very helpful place for my hammer. So I've probably forgotten at least 10 or 15 tools. I'll let you know what I forgot when I remember what it is, but at this point we're going to go ahead and start our pendant. So I'm going to take my piece of sheet metal and I'm going to cut it into 3 pieces. I'm first going to sneeze though, excuse me. Bless you. Oh goodness. I hate allergies. It would be nice if the treadmill feeling would lead to some kind of slimming effect, as, theoretically would happen when one actually was running on a treadmill. Like, come on, why can't I lose a couple of inches?
Yeah.
With all of this craziness.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to take my sheet metal, and I'm just going to cut it into 3 sections. These sections don't have to be round. You just need to make sure that they are all at least as big as, whatever size circle you're planning to make them. So I've got 3 sections here. And you don't have to make this 3 sections long. You can do 2, you can do 1, you can do one big one. Just remember that, as I've talked about before, this butane torch does have a size limitation. Okay, at some point, you're going to get to the point where you've got too much metal that you're trying to solder and it's not going to work for you. So you just need to kind of be aware that that limitation is out there, and that you may run into it at some point. So, you know, don't be too crazy with the amount of metal you're trying to put on this pendant. So now I'm going to texture this piece of metal. So this is a texturing hammer, and there are all kinds of different texturing hammers out there, with all different cool patterns on them. So this is just a kind of a crosshatch pattern and then a straight line pattern. And the cool thing about texturing hammers is they're really easy to use. So I'm going to take this crosshatch pattern and I'm going to bash it all over my metal. If you are leery of your fingers, you can definitely tape your metal down. Voila, textured metal. All right, on my next piece, I'm going to use the line side. All right, so there is that one. And then for my third one, I think I'm going to use the round side of my chasing hammer. So there are lots of different ways that you can texture your metal. It doesn't have to be texturing hammers. Actually, kind of manky old hammers that you find at really cool textures. Also, something that if you have, you know, facility with a Dremel, is you can actually take a regular household hammer, and you can carve out designs on the head of the hammer to make your own custom texturing hammers, which is wicked cool. I've never done that, but I've seen it done. It's very, very fun. You can also do that same thing with files. So you can totally take old hammers, cut them up, make them into texturing hammers. And then there's a lot of awesome texturing hammers out there on the market. Also, you can use found objects to texture. We've done that on stream before, where you take your found object, you put it on your bench block, put your metal on top of it, and then pound on the metal. It'll take on the texture of whatever you're pounding it into, kind of like a rolling mill woodwork. And oh, you can also use things like metal stamps and such to create an area texture on your pieces. So I've got my 3 pieces of textured metal. I'm going to set that aside, and now I'm going to make my 3 circles. So I'm pretty sure that on my prototype, and I think I'm going to stick with this, I use this for my large one, and then I use this for my medium one, this for my small one. So all I'm going to do is take my bail making pliers and my 3x1 rectangle wire. I want to make sure to flush cut the end. So see how this end is a little bit pointy? That's because whatever project I was doing before, I flush cut the end of that project. But since solder will not flow across a gap, it's going to definitely behoove us to have flat edges. So there's my flush cut edge. So I just did that by taking my flush cutter, putting the flat side towards my wire, and just nipping off that point. I'm going to take my bail making pliers, I'm going to grab my wire in my bail making pliers, and I'm just going to roll them around. Once I've reached the point where my wrist won't move any further, I'm just going to loosen, roll back, grab again, and continue to roll around. Now when I get to meet the end that's already there, I just want to pull my wire a little bit above or below so that what I get is a full circle and I don't have this weird kind of bump out where those 2 wires are overlapping. Once I've created that, I'm going to take my flush cutters and I'm going to cut this other side of my coil. So a couple things to think about when you're doing that. Alright, number 1, you want to have the flush side or the flat side of your cutter towards the piece that's staying. So in this scenario, this is the piece that's staying, this is the waste piece. Number 2, you want your cutters to be perpendicular to your metal, so to the edges of your metal. So you'll notice this metal is going off at an angle. So if I cut, in line with my other edge, I'm going to have a pretty severe angle on this metal, which is not what I want. So I want to make sure that I am perpendicular to that metal, and then I can go ahead and snip off. Wow, that was a terrible perpendicular. I think I'd be better at this. Much better. Okay, so there's that cut. So then I should be able to line these up and get a tension fit. I'll do that in a minute. I'm going to cut my other 2 first. So first thing I'm going to do is flush and square my end, because I really did a pretty terrible job of cutting that a minute ago. I'm going to grab my smaller bail making pliers, and I'm going to grab like so, and again I'm just going to rotate around, and once you reach the point where they're going to start to overlap, you just want to pull that one wire to the side a bit so that you got one wire stacked on top of the other. You're going to cut. Alright, so that's my second circle, and then my third one. Again, I'm going to flush and square my end, and then I'm going to use this one to go around. Like so. And cut. Alright, and even if these are not perfectly round at this point, that's okay. We can round them out after we solder them on either a bezel mandrel or a ring mandrel, depending on the size of the circle. So now it's time to go grab my chain nose pliers. I will be right back. Here. I need 2 cents. Okay. Thank you. I know you have 2 cents, but I was already up. Fair enough. I'm going to try them. Ah, got it. Cool beans. Okay, so 2 pairs of chain nose pliers is almost a must when you're dealing with wire that's this thick in this small of a circle. Like in this larger circle, I can manipulate it pretty easily so that I can file it, but in this small circle, it's just way too stiff. So I'm going to grab my chain nose, and I'm going to do 2 things. Number 1, I'm going to sort of bend this and make this into sort of a mostly circular shape. It doesn't have to be perfectly circular, but just a little bit more than it was. And then I'm going to pull these 2 apart like so that I can get my file in there and file it down. So what I have now is I've got wire that's been cut with my wire cutter, and you can see it's got a little burr on the inside there. That is something that I need to file off before I can solder this together. So I'm going to take my file, just place it against my metal, and just push it forward. And if you have a nice sharp file, it shouldn't take that long to file that burr away and get yourself a flat edge. You're going to flip that around, do the same with the other side, like so. And then I'm going to use my chain nose pliers to try and get myself a tension fit. So tension fit is where your ends of wire are pressed against each other and are holding tension against each other without you actually having to hold them, so that you can solder them, because obviously fingers in the path of the torch is nobody's idea of a good time. Okay, so there is that one ready to solder. Is it round? No. Is it together? Yes. That second one is more important. How was the experiment?
Well,
oh, it popped off the...
yeah, because it's glued on.
Got
I
it.
did manage to make an impression
Cool.
with the 1.5 millimeter stamps.
So I wonder... So one theoretically could pop the plaques off and then stamp them and then glue them back on. Okay, so this goes to a question from our sale last night, which is on these wooden beads with the brass. Can you stamp on them? And so Heather tried an experiment. She was able to get an impression with the smallest, the 1.5 millimeter stamps, but it most of the time popped the plaque off of the bead, since the plaque is just glued onto the bead. So if you were going to try that, your best bet would probably be to, get an X-Acto or something under here and pop your brass piece off, stamp on it, and then glue it back onto your bead. But the bead did not explode, so that's, always a plus.
That is a plus. So, they're stronger than I would have expected.
True story. Okay, so now this is my second loop, and I'm going to go ahead and file that. Okay. What type of glue would you use to put them back on? Probably 2-part epoxy. Tends to be my solution to everything. Okay, so now I'm going to tension fit this one. Alright, once again, now that's ready for soldering. And then we have, don't roll away. You said you could roll away. Alright, and then we've got our third one. So once again, when I'm filing, I'm just putting my file perpendicular to my metal, and I'm trying to just flatten out that edge so that I can get good contact in my joint. Like so. And so the bigger one is definitely easier to manipulate. Alright, so there we go. That's our third joint ready to solder. Okay, so I think it's time for us to solder this together. So whilst I'm getting my soldering stuff set up, I am going to treat you all to, of course, my now internet famous, except not really, 5-point soldering safety lecture. So when you are soldering, okay, whether you are soldering in a community workspace or in a workspace in your own home, there are several things that are important to know and observe in order to make your soldering experience as safe as possible. So number one, try and keep at least 6 to 8 inches of clear space between your torch and anything that is flammable or meltable at all times. As long as you do that, your chances of accidentally starting a fire or melting an expensive piece of broadcasting equipment are very, very small. And number two, once you've had a flame going in your workspace, from that point forward, always assume that everything in your workspace is hot enough to burn you, because it probably is, even if it doesn't look like it. Number three, ventilation is important. Even if you can't breathe through your nose, ventilation is still important. If you're feeling coughing, hacking, wheezing, or otherwise uncomfortable in the lung area after you've been soldering, you probably need to re-examine your ventilation situation. Number four, if you are not actively using your torch to solder, turn it off. These torches are very easy to ignite. They're very easy to extinguish. There's absolutely no reason to leave them burning when you're not actively using them. And number five, know where your fire extinguisher is. If you are setting up a soldering workstation in your own home, you really should make sure you have a fire extinguisher within arm's reach. If you're in a community work area, you need to know where the fire extinguisher is at all times, because if you need the fire extinguisher, chances are you're probably not going to have a lot of time to run around and try and find it. Now, bear in mind that I am not a credentialed anything as far as safety goes. I'm actually not really credentialed with anything other than a Bachelor of Arts in Theater. So I really am just some rando on the internet. There's really no reason to listen to me. However, I have been teaching soldering for upwards of 10 years, and these are points that over and over again come up as far as safety in the home workspace and also keeping yourself and your community members safe when you're in a community workspace. As always, if you are creating a home workspace, I highly encourage you to consult actual experts and do everything you can to make your home workspace as safe as possible. So now that we've had that lovely safety lecture, we're going to go ahead and solder these babies together. So I've got them on my soldering board. This is a solderite board. It's my favorite type of soldering workspace because it's a little bit cleaner than a charcoal brick. But if you like charcoal brick, kiln brick, like whatever your preferred soldering surface is totally fine. I'm going to paint each of these with flux, and I'm going to paint them all over because we're going to be doing multiple joints on these, multiple solderings, and so I want to keep them as clean as possible. So what is flux? Flux is a chemical, and mine is borax based, that keeps your metal from oxidizing. So the first thing that's going to happen when we hit any metal that is base metal or has base metal components with a torch is your metal is going to oxidize, meaning it's going to turn black. The problem with that is that your black oxide layer is a barrier through which your solder cannot flow. And that's a problem. So we need to protect the metal from that oxide barrier. We do that with the flux. The flux that I prefer is called Handy Flux. It's that white pasty substance in the jar that I showed you earlier, but there are lots of other fluxes out there. There are liquid fluxes, there are gel fluxes, so if you don't find the Handy Flux to your liking, don't worry. There's plenty of fluxes out there for you to try. Now I'm going to take my 3 pieces of solder that I cut, and this is the medium solder. This is the highest melting point that I'm using in this process because this is my first series of joints. So let's talk for just a brief moment about solder densities. So what solder is, especially what is sterling silver solder, is a really good question. So sterling silver solder is sterling silver, which is typically an alloy of silver and copper, and that alloy has additional zinc added to it. What that zinc does is it brings the melting point of the entire alloy down below the melting point of the sterling silver that you'll be soldering. And this is what allows the soldering process to happen. This is what allows us to solder things together without melting them, theoretically, is that the solder melts at a lower temperature than the metal with which you are fabricating. Now, because metallurgists are awesome, they actually make sterling silver solder in different what's called densities, basically different concentrations of zinc in the solder. The more zinc, the lower the melting point of the solder. So you've got your densities are usually denoted as hard, medium, easy, and extra easy, with hard being the highest melting point, extra easy being the lowest melting point. I will say that I personally have issues with this tiny butane torch and hard solder, so I tend to start at medium for most of my projects. So that's what I have going for my project today. So I've got medium solder because this is my first set of joints. So I've taken my little pieces of solder, and these are tiny. These are like 1/16 of an inch. You really don't need that much solder to close a joint, and I've set them underneath my joint so that my silver is resting on top of my solder. Now I'm going to take my torch, light it, and I'm going to start heating these up. So I'm going to heat each of these up, and I'm heating the whole thing. So you can see my torch is going around the whole thing. The reason for that is that metal conducts heat. So if you don't heat the whole thing, any part that you're not heating is going to be sucking heat away from the joint. It's going to be acting as what is called a heat sink. And if you get too much of a heat sink effect going, your solder is not going to flow. So once my flux is turned clear, that's telling me that my metal's reached a temperature where solder can flow. So now I'm going to concentrate on the joint. And okay, so you probably saw that drop down, and my solder flowed, but the problem here is it's all over on this side of the joint. So solder flows towards heat. So what I want to do is I want to put my heat on this side of the joint, and I want to convince it to come over, which it did. All right, so that one is now soldered closed. All right, 2 more to go. The bigger your piece, the longer it's going to take. So this is my largest piece. This is probably going to take me a little bit longer to heat. But once my flux turns clear, just focus on your joint. And ideally, that's what I want. Ideally, I want to just draw my solder up, straight up my joint. Just remember, solder always flows towards the hottest point. That means that aim and technique is important. And when you're doing this, you should try and get your torch straight down on your metal rather than doing it at an angle. And I'm going to heat the joint. And there we go. All right, so all three of those babies are soldered, closed. And so now we're going to round them out. So it's so much easier to re-round these once they've been soldered. It's always easier to shape a closed shape than an open shape. So I'm going to go ahead and just move my soldering station aside for a minute. I'm going to grab my bezel mandrel. Bezel mandrels are a super useful thing to have around your work area. They are just these tiny steel mandrels. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put that on my mandrel. I'm going to grab my mallet. And I'm just going to pound this back into shape. So ideally, the reason we're using a mallet here is because we don't want to actually compress the metal on the walls of our shape. We want to be able to use the percussive force of the hammer to shape it. We want to actually make it any bigger. And then since this mandrel is tapered, I'm going to go ahead and pull my metal off, flip it over, and repeat. This is just so that I don't get a cone-shaped piece, so that I actually stay with a cylindrical piece. Oh dear. Things are falling off because of all the vibration. Okay, so that is relatively circular. I have some thoughts about that bit right there, but we're just at this point, we're just going to go with it. So there's that. Now we're going to do this with my next size up. That's going to go obviously significantly further down on my mandrel. Alright, there's 2 circles. Alright, and my third one, I think I'm going to have to do on actually my proper ring mandrel. Yeah, so that's going to go on the end of that. And I can do the same thing. Okay, so there's that, and that's our 3 circles. Okay, so now it's time to solder these 3 circles down to our pieces of metal. I'm going to do that by sweating solder onto the backs of my circles, because what I ideally want to avoid, since I'm going to be using silver solder for all of this, is I want to avoid, getting solder on the metal on the inside of my circle, because it's going to be really obvious. It's not going to look as nice and professional as I want. Now, in order to make sure that these solder down nice and neatly, I'm going to just grab a piece of 320 grit sandpaper, and just like this were an actual bezel, I'm just going to put my circle on there, and I'm just going to rub it back and forth just to even, I know, right? A lot of stress relief hammering tonight. And I was using a disc cutter earlier to make my samples for classes for next week. So I just want to flatten out the bottom. Also, this is going to help get rid of if there's any kind of, crud or junk on the bottom of our circle, because as I've discussed before, silver solder doesn't like flowing on dirty metal. Okay, it's real princessy about that. So I want that nice and clean and of course, flat. So once I'm done with one, I'm just going to do the other two. So there's that one, and then the last one. This one was the wonkiest shape, so this one needs the most sanding. And again, this is because solder cannot flow across a gap. In addition to cleaning the bottoms of these, we need to make sure that they're flat or they won't solder down onto our pieces of metal. Now that being said, our pieces of metal also need to be flat. That's why I pounded them with the mallet after I textured them. So I'm going to take, oh dear, oh no. Unclear. Goodness. One of them rolled off the edge of the table. I don't know exactly where it went. So we may just be doing a 2-part pendant tonight instead of a 3-part pendant. Oh wait, I think I see it. All right, I'm going table diving. So everybody wish me luck. I will refix the camera when I get back. All right, I will be right back. Okay, so I did survive, and I found the piece. So, hooray on both counts. Now, I knocked my cameras all over the place, so let's see how they look. Okay, that's not terrible. Okay, so I'm going to put these guys on my soldering board with the sanded side up. And I'm going to go ahead and sweat some solder onto my pieces. So that means I'm going to flux them. Make sure I've got flux all the way around. And then I'm going to cut a couple of pieces of solder for each. So now I'm going to go down to easy solder. So I've got my easy solder piece, and I'm going to cut, for this one I'm going to do 2, for this one I'm going to do 3, for this one I'm going to do 4. So that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pieces. And again, small pieces, a 1/16 of an inch. The more solder you use, the more likely it is that you're going to, flow solder, overflow solder from where you want. All right, so I've got my 9 pieces of solder. I'm going to grab my tweezers and I'm just going to place them onto the edges of my circles. So I want them sitting right on top. And just space them kind of equidistant. So the reason I bumped down to easy solder now is because I don't want to destroy the joint that I made in these circles by reflowing that solder and having my circles pop open. So theoretically, by going down to easy solder, I'm not ever going to have to get my circles hot enough to blow my first joints. Alright, so there's that. Now, we're going to sweat the solder. That means we're going to melt the solder onto the circles. So I'm just going to heat them up. And once again, when my flux turns clear, that's telling me that my metal has reached a temperature where solder can flow. Oh no. I just want to make sure that stays up on top because I don't want it to roll to the inside. Alright, so then I'm going to heat until... Alright, so see? That's sweat. Try and keep your heat directly on top to minimize the chances of it rolling down. It's probably going to roll down a little bit, but on the inside of the silver it doesn't matter so much. You just don't want it on the copper. Alright, so heat them up there, and 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now I have sweat the solder onto all of my pieces. Now I'm going to grab my pieces of metal, and each one I'm going to flux and set on my soldering surface. And then I'm going to place one of my circles on top of each one. And make sure there's no gunk or solder board residue that's stuck to the bottoms of them. So what that means is what you probably want to do as far as picking them up is you want to heat them a little bit to unstick them from the board. And then they should come up nice and easy. And the reason sometimes your pieces stick to your board is just because of the flux. It's because the flux is solid when it is cold and liquid when it's hot. And so you just are, goodness, everything got really bright all of a sudden. Yeah, so you're just dealing with the flux in its solid state, solidifying and bonding essentially, you know, whatever it's touching to whatever else it happens to be touching. So all you have to do to get that off is just heat it up again and it'll come off really easily. But yeah, I don't quite know why it decided to just get super bright all of a sudden, but there you go, there's a little bit more reasonable of an exposure at the moment. So now we're going to heat this until that solder reflows and bonds everything together. So I'm just heating everything, and once my flux turns clear, I want to concentrate on the outside edge of this because I'm trying to get that solder to bond, you know, to reflow and bond my two pieces together, but I want it to flow to the outside, not the inside. So once again, I don't want a big bloom of solder on that piece. Also, hashtag pro tip, put the solder side down, not up. I'm sitting here watching the solder flowing on the top of my circle going, wait a minute, that's wrong. That's very wrong. So solder side down, people, if you're sweat soldering. Very importante. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so you can see the solder kind of forming a line there. So it's very similar to zipping a bezel. You just want to make sure that solder goes all the way around and bonds the whole circle down onto your backing piece. So sometimes you have to sort of press that with your tweezers to get that to work. You just want to pull your solder around and get that whole thing zipped up. And it takes a fair amount of heat because this is not a small piece of metal at all. Okay, it's a large piece of metal. There we go. So, meanwhile, praying to the gods of, the internet that I don't melt my webcam with all of this heat. Because it was a very similar project to this one that caused the great webcam melting incident of the latter part of 2020. Okay, and this is also what I mean by you're gonna run into at some point a heat limitation with this, where my torch is literally not gonna be big enough to create enough heat to, do what I need it to do. That's not the case here, but you're seeing how much heat I'm having to put into this in order to make it work, and so that's just where you want to be cautious when you're planning larger projects with a butane torch, is just know that the torch isn't always up for it. Now there are ways to work around this. You can definitely use thinner sheet metal. You don't have to use as big a piece. Yes, Lori, that's what I was about to say. You don't have to use as big a piece of metal. Like, I definitely could have cut this much closer. See, it's really dark. You could have cut this much closer to the back piece as well. So yes, there are definitely ways that you can get around that size limitation by manipulating, how much metal you have. But one of the things I find is most important for me to remember is don't forget that thickness of your metal is definitely a factor. Okay, so one way to decrease the amount of metal is to change the thickness. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm going to pickle this because this is really dirty and I need to solder these together. I don't think it's going to work well if I leave it that dirty. So pickle is a weak acid solution. What it's going to do is it's going to clean all that junk off of my piece so that I can continue to work on it. So I'm going to do the same thing for my other two. This should be a little easier because these are smaller pieces of metal. Make sure it's sitting flat on your solder board because your solder board is designed to absorb and reflect heat. So it's designed to make your job easier by making your piece heat more quickly and stay warm. So if your piece is lifted up off of your solder board, you're not actually optimally using that particular property of your solder board. Okay, so that one went so much faster, like wham bam, and it's zipped. And that's just because it's a much smaller piece of metal. All right, and last one. And yes, you can put your pieces into the pickle hot. It actually works better if you do that. So this one should be the fastest one of all. And there we go. We are zipped. All right, so into the pickle this one goes. Hopefully my first one is reasonably pickled by now, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. And what I'm looking for is just for most of the black to be gone, which it is. Doesn't have to be pristine, but you just want it to be mostly clean. You want a lot of that black junk to just be gone off of it, which the pickle has accomplished for me. So now I'm going to go ahead and cut away all of my extra metal. So I'm just going to take my shears, and this is very similar to a bezel. I'm going to take my shears and I'm just going to cut around the edge of that metal so that I have just my circle remaining and nothing else. And the 24 gauge copper is pretty easy to cut. As I said in previous tutorials, if you have any hand strength issues, you have any issues, with cutting metal, copper is going to be your best. Oh, for goodness sakes! Apparently, I need to fix that. I need to re-up famous as a word that's not allowed on the stream. But so yeah, copper is going to be your easiest metal to cut. So if you have any problems with hand strength or anything like that, copper is a really good choice. Okay, so now I'm just going to take my file and file those, because I cut, but of course you can't always get a really smooth edge with your metal shear, so I'm just going to file this flush with my side piece.
Side piece.
Apparently, I'm also going to file my nail. Whatever. Okay, so I'm just continuing filing this flush. Okay, so we're going to call that good enough. Now I'm going to repeat that with my other two pieces. Again, they're smaller, so this should go faster. Guide those off, and then just once again cut around your circles. And obviously, the closer and more precisely you cut, the less you're going to have to file. Alright, and then once again, just file that back so that it's flush. The little one is always the hardest to hang on to. You could, if you wanted to, put this in a ring clamp or something to make it easier to hold. Or you can just do like I'm doing and, file all of your fingers and fingernails while you're doing this. I'm going to say that's efficiency, right? Or something. You could also do this with a sanding wheel and your flex shaft, so you don't have to do this by hand. You could absolutely utilize power tools to help you in this instance, and it would go faster. And that's more nail. So I'm just really trying to take that back flush with the edge of my circle here. So let's see. I feel like somebody out there probably has the question, even if they haven't asked it, of can you pre-cut your circles, say, using a disc cutter? And the answer is yes, you can, but it is sometimes difficult to get them lined up properly, so sometimes I feel like it's more trouble than it's worth, and that this way is just a little bit easier because you can cut them exactly to match. You don't have to worry so much about lining up where your circles are in the first place. So this method is more appealing to me, but yes, you could absolutely pre-cut your metal circles. There's nothing in the world saying that you cannot. Come back here. Let's try not to lose this again. Because ain't nobody got time for that.
Mm-mm.
Okay, and then now that I have 5 of those, you may want to take some sandpaper and just hit this edge right here. I'm going to skip that, but it can get a little sharp there, so if you're feeling like that's not going to be comfortable to wear as a pendant, you can definitely hit that with some steel wool or some of your 320 grit sandpaper and knock that edge down just a bit. Okay, so now we're going to make our bail. Now we're going to solder everything together. So my bail is going to be made with a little bit of 18 gauge wire, apparently accompanied by an earthquake. And I'm just going to make a little coiled bail, so I can do that with my round nose pliers. I'm just going to coil my wire around my round nose, and I'm just going to put each new coil beneath the coil that came before it. And this way I make sure that I never run out of space on my pliers and I have consistently sized coils. I'm going to trim that off. So what I want on this is I just want a little bit of overlap on the bottom, like so. Set that aside somewhere where I won't lose it. Grab my soldering board back. Okay, so now let's put this baby together. So you can go big to small, small to big. I went big to small on my prototype, so let's go small to big on this project. Throw that on with the tweezers. Okay, so the pickling is going to have taken off the flux, so I'm just going to flux the backs of this pendant. And I'm going to flux the top here where I'm going to put my bail, and I'm going to flux the bottom of my bail. I'm going to make sure I have a tweezers handy. And now I'm going to go to my extra easy solder. Okay, and I'm going to take a piece of my extra easy solder, I'm going to put it at each of these joints, and then I'm going to sweat one onto that top of my pendant right there. So I need 3. So there is 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to place those. So what I want is I want to make sure that there's contact between those pendant pieces. Obviously I want to make sure they're lined up, okay, kind of like a snowman. Not a crooked snowman, but an upright, upstanding, happy, non-melting snowman. Okay, so we're going to start with those 2, and then the one that I'm going to sweat onto there, I'm going to have to transfer with my solder pick. If I knew where my solder pick was. There it is. It slid all the way to the back. Alright, so here we go. So my first job is going to be to flow these 2 pieces to join my whole pendant together. Then I'm going to grab this last piece that's over here. I'm going to transfer it onto there. Then I'm going to add my bail. So I'm just going to heat everything. You can see my flux reacting to the heat. It's going to turn white and then it's going to turn clear. Once it turns clear, that tells me that my metal has reached the temperature where solder can flow. And once that happens, I'm just going to concentrate on each of the joints, and my goal is to get that to flow down in between those 2 circles and join them together. And of course I am trying to be careful of my camera, which is why I have some sort of odd angles going on with my torch right now. Because I'm trying to keep the heat going that way instead of this way. Alright, there's that one. Alright, did you see it just went right down in between those? This one, however, did not. This one flowed on the back there. That is not what we wanted at all. So we're going to go ahead and try this other piece of solder there. So I just grab that on my pick and I'm just going to hold that there. Okay, so we're going to try a slightly different angle to try and put the heat where I want the solder to go. I'm going to try and go from here. So I'm focusing more down on this joint to try and pull that solder down and in between instead of flowing it up and across. There we go. Did you see it? It just like jumped right under there. That's the cool thing about solder, is it really does, you know, it's very attracted to the heat. You can actually make it do cool things. You can make it flow counter to gravity using the heat, which is pretty fun. Okay, and last thing is I'm going to sweat this piece of solder onto the top. So by when I'm pick transferring, I just melted my solder and then I grabbed it on my pick, so I've got a little ball. And then I'm just going to heat my metal and touch that ball to my metal. And since solder flows towards heat, my solder will come off my pick and stick to my metal as long as that metal is hotter than my pick. I'm going to grab my bail and my tweezers and just sort of rest that against where that solder is. And then I'm just going to heat the whole thing until that solder flows and bonds my bail to the pendant, which it has not yet done. It flowed, but it didn't bond. Nope. If you can get it to balance like that, that's awesome. That makes it a lot easier because you can get all of the angles because you're not trying to not burn yourself. But sometimes it won't balance like that. And sometimes it's just a pain in the butt. Well, it's on there. Unfortunately, it's crooked. Sorry, that shifted over. Really? Come on. I'm trying to finish this project. Haha! Okay, so success in one arena and failure in another. So I unsoldered these two pieces. So thankfully that should be a little bit easier to correct. I'm just going to set those back to where they are contacting each other. I'm going to hope my bail doesn't fall off. And I'm just going to reheat that. Nope. This does not want to go on there. Alright, so in a situation like this, your best bet is going to be to add a little bit more flux because there's a chance that there's some oxide or something in there that's making the solder not want to flow. Place your pieces back together and I'm going to add a little bit more solder. Yes, we have a lot of solder on that joint already, but it really doesn't seem to want to go where I want it to go, so when in doubt, add more solder. Now, if I could go down any further on the melting points, if I had an extra easy, I would definitely use it at this point because I am really concerned about this bail joint and this other joint, but unfortunately, this is as low as it goes, so we are just going to have to try and persuade it that it wants to be friendly and cooperative. Alright, and I think we have friendly solder for the win. I'll let that cool for just a second, and hopefully, haha, it's stuck to the solder board, but it's also all soldered together. So this is where just a little bit of heat, not enough to reflow your solder, just enough to liquefy the flux, is going to help you get this off your board in one piece. Alright, there we go. Haha! Alright. All soldered together. So now we're going to pickle it, which is going to clean all the crud off of it. Now, so this is going to give me a quick opportunity to talk about super pickle. Okay, so what is pickle? I kind of touched on that a minute ago. Pickle is a weak acid solution that's going to clean your metal up so that you can continue to solder on it, or so that you can polish it and make it pretty to wear. Now, if you're soldering with brass or bronze, what happens when you solder brass or bronze is the soldering will oxidize either the zinc or the tin, which is the part of the brass or bronze alloy that is not copper. And once you, okay webcam? Okay, cool. And then once you pickle it, it's going to remove those oxides, and it's going to leave you with a layer of depletion gilded copper on the surface of your piece. So you need to chemically strip that copper layer away in order to return your metal to its native yellow color. You do that with what's called super pickle. So after you've pickled your pieces to get rid of all the oxides, then you put them in super pickle, which is 50-50, 1-to-1, hydrogen peroxide and white vinegar. Leave your pieces in there until your metal turns yellow, and then you can polish them as usual. I used copper and sterling only for my piece tonight so that I didn't have to mess with super pickle, because once again, I started late, I'm ending late. I know that some of you actually have other things to do tonight than just watch the Beading Dreams stream. I mean, that sounds like a kind of a boring evening myself, but I've heard that people have lives and things. Alright, so I'm going to pull it out of the pickle, and I'm going to grab my my quadruple zero steel wool. So this is a good grit of steel wool for buffing, because it's not going to put big scratches on your piece. Now, if I were not doing this piece on stream, if I had all the time in the world, at this point I would not be buffing it by hand, because this piece has a lot of nooks and crannies, and it's going to be difficult to get a good buff on it by hand. So what I would be doing with this piece, if I had all the time in the world, is I would put it in my tumbler, and I would tumble it until it's shiny. And that's what I did with this piece here. So you can see how nice and shiny it is. The steel wool is going to give us a nice satiny finish, which is also, you know, attractive, but not quite as attractive to most folks as the shiny finish. You also could buff this with, I'm just going to keep hitting my camera, so sorry y'all, it is what it is. But anyway, you also could buff this with a rotary tool and a buffing wheel, and then you can use something called a polishing pin, which is kind of a little pointy object to get down inside these little bits and buff the copper in there, because that is going to be really difficult for me to do nicely with my steel wool, to the point where I don't know that I'm actually going to really be able to do it. A little bit. Yay! Hi, Albie Clay. Lurking and cooking. What are you cooking? We are very food-oriented stream, so we must, if somebody says they've been cooking, we must know what they've been cooking. It's a rule. So I'm just buffing all of the surfaces with the steel wool. Apparently I'm going to get steel wool on myself. I'm going to smack my camera. So many things that I'm doing with the steel wool. Okay, so that is, alright, that's about as buff as my pendant is gonna get. So once again, this is a really good piece to do if you have a tumbler, because if you just throw it in your tumbler, let it tumble for a day or so, the tumbler shot, ooh, yum, that sounds delish. Your shot will get all in there, and it will do a really nice job of polishing that copper for you without you having to mess with getting in there with steel wool or a polishing pin. But since I was trying to finish this on stream, which I successfully did, thank goodness. I didn't even melt it, yay. I did it with the steel wool, but once again, this is a really good candidate for tumbling because the tumbler does a really good job of getting in the nooks and crannies. Also, you know how I was saying that this sometimes gets a little sharp back here? The tumbler does a really good job of kind of taking off that burr as well without you having to actively sand it away. All right, so that is actually the conclusion of our Torch Thursday fabrication stream. Thank you all for hanging out with me through that whole thing, making our mixed metal pendant. Way fun, love it. So for anybody out there who doesn't know me, I'm Allison from Beading Dreams in Dallas, Texas. We are an actual brick and mortar retail bead store. We are here on Lovers Lane in Dallas. We have physical premises and we are open for business. Thanks, ASO. Monday through Saturday from 1 to 6. So if you're local in Dallas, we are here to feed your need to bead. If you are not local in Dallas, you can find us on this channel, twitch.tv/Beading Dream 5 times a week with complimentary tutorials. We stream Wednesday through Saturday at 6 p.m. Central Time because we are in Dallas, Texas. Yay! Bye, Lori! Happy stream watching for the rest of the night. Yeah, so we are here on this channel, twitch.tv/Beading Dream at 6 p.m. Central Time, Wednesday through Saturday with complimentary tutorial streams. Thursday night is always a torch stream for those of you who like fire. And we do also stream a bonus tutorial at noon on Thursdays. And we usually do a pretty simple, easy project for our lunchtime stream. That one's usually tons of fun. And then we do live merchandise sales every Wednesday and Saturday at 7:30 p.m. So that means we'll be back on this channel, twitch.tv/Beading Dream tomorrow, Friday at 6 p.m. Central with our Freeform Friday stream. That means that I'm going to pick a project, I'm not quite sure what yet, and I'm going to do it or attempt to do it on stream from start to finish. So it's always a good time. I never quite know what I'm going to do until I start the stream. So tune in for some exciting improvisational fun tomorrow night on the Beading Dream stream. If you're not going to make it tomorrow night, of course, we'll be back on this channel on Saturday at 6 p.m. with this project. This is our pearl vine earrings, so it's a fun little wire wrapping project. So hopefully we'll see you. If we don't see you tomorrow on Freeform, we'll see you on Saturday for the earring stream, and that of course is followed by a live merchandise sale. So everyone have a fantastic Thursday night. Thank you again so much for taking part of your Thursday night, spending it with us here on the Beading Dream stream, and I will see you all back on this channel, twitch.tv/Beading Dream tomorrow at 6 or on another stream really soon.